Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for joining us for Nature and the American Story at 250. As we approach this milestone anniversary, I've been reflecting on a question that first drew me in many years ago before I even worked in public policy when I was learning about the Hudson River School painters. I was looking at works like Thomas Cole's Oxbow from 1836 and Asher Brown Durand's Kindred Spirits 1849, and Frederick Church's Niagara in 1857, all paintings that I suspect are familiar to our audience today. But it's clear that these artists weren't simply painting landscapes. They were trying to capture something deeper, a sense that the American land itself carried moral meaning. And their works were tinged not only with beauty, but with history and spirituality. For the painters of the Hudson River School, the wilderness wasn't just scenery, it was a source of American national identity. And in a young country without deep historical roots, the landscape itself became a kind of inheritance. It offered both inspiration and warning, a vision of abundance and possibility, but much like our founding generation, also a reminder of the fragility of our young republic and of civic virtue. That idea that our relationship to the land reflects who we are as a people has echoed through American history. It shaped westward expansion, informed our conservation movement, and continues to influence how we think about growth, energy, and environmental stewardship today. So as we reflect on 250 years of the American story, it's worth asking, what has the land meant to us? What should it mean to us today? And how do we carry that legacy forward? And that's exactly what we're here to explore today. So first, let me introduce our wonderful panelists. First, we're joined by Alan Taylor, one of the nation's leading historians of early America, Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia, where he held the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in History. I first encountered Professor Taylor's work as an undergraduate when I read his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, William Cooperstown, a study of frontier life in the early republic. Through the story of a single town and its founder, Taylor captures something much larger, how Americans settled the land, built communities, and in the process, reshaped both the landscape and their political culture. Professor Taylor is the author of numerous influential works, including American Colonies, American Revolutions, and American Republics, and is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for his contributions to American history. So we're delighted you could join us today. Mark Miller is also with us. He is a leading expert in environmental law and natural resource policy. He serves as Director of Environment and Natural Resources Litigation at the Pacific Legal Foundation, where he leads an abundance-first approach to protecting property rights and addressing government overreach in land, water, and energy policy. And we'll definitely be talking about abundance today. Mark has litigated major cases at every level of the judiciary, including multiple unanimous victories at the Supreme Court on behalf of property owners. His work focuses on how legal frameworks shape the management of natural resources, bringing a practical lens to questions of conservation, development, and stewardship. So his perspective is especially valuable in this conversation. And finally, we are joined by Alina Voss, Communications Director at the American Conservation Coalition, whose mission is to build a conservative environmental movement. Alina brings a fresh and important perspective to today's conversation, particularly on the intersection of environmental stewardship, energy policy, public engagement, and the ideas of limited effective government, which is really important to us at R Street. Her work focuses on advancing market-oriented and innovation-driven approaches to environmental challenges, and her writing has appeared in outlets like National Review, The Washington Examiner, and Real Clear Energy. Prior to joining ACC, Alina spent time working in government technology, including with NASA and General Services Administration, experience that I think gives her a unique vantage point on how policy, innovation, and infrastructure intersect and shape the way we think about the land. And Alina is an avid hiker. So with all of that, let's jump right in. Alan, I'd love to start with you. Many early Americans, and particularly as I noted in my introduction, the Hudson River School painters, saw the American landscape as something moral or spiritual. How do you know the early Americans to understand the relationship between nature and national identity? And if you could, maybe you can touch both on the early American settlers, but also on Native Americans.
Thank you. So the Hudson River School is a new generation in their thinking, and so it's quite different from the founding generation. Whereas you quite nicely laid out their sense of there's something spiritual in the landscape, something essential to the American identity. That's not really how the people of the later 18th century thought. They thought of it in very pragmatic terms, very utilitarian terms, that the environment, if they thought about it in religious terms, it was actually a problem. It was a howling wilderness. It needed to be subdued. So they had a sense of the wilderness as something threatening, but also something that if you could cut down the forest and clear fields and create farms, that you would have, that would be the American identity that would emerge out of an environmental transformation.
That's great. And Mark, maybe we can bring you in here as well, especially given your work out in South Dakota. As the country expanded westward, how did that earlier vision of nature evolve as you see it? Did Americans continue to see the land as something that needed to be tamed, as Alan is mentioning, that was frightening in many ways, or that could be used and developed? And are those two things even in conflict?
Yeah. Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to the Art Street Institute for asking me to be part of this. This is fantastic. It's an honor to speak with Alan and Alina and with your audience. To your question, I think the key insight, and really the professor got at it very much so, is that Americans never saw a contradiction between reverence for nature, like that artwork that you were referring to, the Hudson River artwork, sort of demonstrates for us how much as Americans we appreciated nature, but also no contradiction with reverence and also using it, which is what the professor was saying, that they understood both as part of human freedom. Americans saw land both as beautiful and as something they could work, improve, and make their own. So property rights, which is what we sort of focus on at Pacific Legal Foundation through the courts, and productive use of land were central to liberty. And that's what that American identity was all about. And so as we expanded westward as a country, the balance may have shifted, a little bit, but not in principle. What changed was, how we adopted to the land and exercised our freedom through settlement, industry, and infrastructure. I found it amazing just to sort of personalize it, even though we're talking about 250 years of American history. But a part of my career, I spent a few years working in the upper Midwest in South Dakota. And it's amazing to think that 100 and now 50 years ago or so, there are the ancestors of many of the same families who tamed that land, is very rugged land in South Dakota, for anyone who knows South Dakota, particularly West River. And their great great grandchildren are now working that same land. And they knew back then and they know now. And in fact, just to make it seem real to everyone, it's sort of from the TV show Little House on the Prairie, that even though again that's idealized, it was TV, but nevertheless, the Ingalls family lived in Minnesota, lived in South Dakota, lived in Iowa, and they went back and forth. But that rugged country that Pa and the Ingalls and everyone else had to tame, they appreciated nature, but they also had to tame nature and work the land. And so that idea that free people were engaging the land, building and farming and producing, it wasn't in conflict with stewardship, and just as it shouldn't be today.
Two sides of the same coin. Alan, I wonder if you might be able to expand a little bit on that in terms of westward expansion. As we were talking earlier this week, saying, westward expansion means a lot of things, right? The Hudson River Valley was westward expansion, but then there was so much more, as Mark points out. Can you talk us through some of that just for our viewers?
Yes, so the United States, when it emerges from the American Revolution, is a country where almost all of the people who are citizens of this new republic lived east of the Appalachian Mountains. And there were the startings, the beginnings of new settlements in Kentucky and Tennessee, but they were very small. But the people of that generation understood that the country would take shape progressively as more and more people moved westward. And the primary goal of land policy in that generation was to provide modest-sized farms to the maximum number of people because of a conviction that this new republic benefited from a rough equality of property, so that all of the citizens would have a quality that was known as independence. So this isn't national independence, but this is the independence of farm households. So the hope was that there would be a broad citizenry of people who owned their own property, and that it was the goal of governments, both state government and the federal government, to allocate land in ways that would maximize the number of property owning citizens.
That's so great. And I appreciate that you brought the role of government into this because that's something that we think a lot about at R Street. And I know at Pacific Legal Foundation, at ACC. And Alina, I want to bring you into the conversation with that in mind. As someone who believes both in the virtue of limited government and sound conservation policies, I'm wondering what you're thinking about what our founders sort of understood about the connection between land and government and what we might be in danger of forgetting today as we approach the nation's 250th birthday.
Definitely. I think Dr. Taylor's point on kind of property ownership ties into what our original vision of stewardship was like. And certainly the idea that in order to understand what should be done with the land, you probably will have some relation to it and a responsibility for it, which in our earliest conceptions largely came out of your direct ownership over it. It wasn't just something that you voted for and was very far away. And I think that in many ways, with the flux of modern life and development of civilization, we've kind of lost some of those earlier ties to the land. I personally don't have to worry about whether my meal is going to come and whether I'm going to have dinner based on the weather anymore. I mean, in many ways, we don't even think about what fruits or vegetables are in season at this stage. And I think a lot of those things are good. Capitalism has brought us away from world hunger in many ways. I think it's amazing. At the same time, I do think that we've sort of gotten into an all or nothing vision of conservation, largely led by the political left in terms of seeing it as preservation or nothing, a zero-sum game between man and nature. And I think when you don't have a vision for how man and nature coexist, you don't see them as symbiotic, you see them as two opposing forces. And I think that's kind of pushed us into a much more preservationist concept of what it means to relate to the land rather than conservation and truly that value of stewardship that I think many of our original founders would have probably found a bit more intuitive given their connection to the land, whereas today it feels a bit foreign to us, or it's something we have to actively bring into our concept of environmentalism.
That's really insightful, and I'm glad that you brought up the difference between sort of preservation and conservation, because the United States has a long tradition of both, from the creation of national parks to modern environmentalism. The figure who I think comes to mind here is more recent, but Theodore Roosevelt, given his legacy and conservation of public lands. And if you haven't been to his home on Long Island, Sagamore Hill, I encourage you to. It really does sort of demonstrate his love of the natural world. Alina, maybe we'll just stick with you for a moment. What do you think Teddy Roosevelt got right, and where do you think that his legacy creates challenges for us today?
I think Roosevelt got a lot right. He recognized that natural resources need to be managed, not just exploited. He made conservation a national priority. I think he also provided us with a lot of the vocabulary and more like pop political philosophy that hadn't necessarily been as widely articulated at the time. He gave the public kind of a lot to grapple with for the first time. At the same time, I think, especially in terms of the foundations that it laid for federal policy, his legacy often reinforced kind of a more top-down approach to conservation. And I think today that can create tension, especially when DC is making decisions for those of us in, let's say, flyover country. I live in Ohio, who see things like, market inefficiencies created by bureaucracy or maybe gaps between legislation and what's actually needed. The Farm Bill comes to mind, basically every year. I don't necessarily think that he could or should have foreseen what bureaucracy would look like in 2026, but I think the opportunity now is to build on his vision and make it more responsive to modern needs rather than just trying to force everything from the top down with the highest level of policy that we can reach it with.
And Alan, I imagine that there's other people between the founding and Theodore Roosevelt who you might have in mind. Are there other sort of figures who you think have made an important mark on our sort of conception of either preservation versus conservation?
Well, Thomas Jefferson is a key in that he is ultimately responsible for the Louisiana Purchase, which virtually doubles the size of the United States. But he had what would seem to us an odd idea, which is that the new lands he'd acquired, he didn't think would be particularly good for agriculture, even though they include places like Iowa and the Dakotas. So what he wanted to do was to relocate forcibly, if necessary, all of the native people living east of the Mississippi and push them out there and create this vast Indian reservation. And that would free up lands that he thought were good for agriculture, including places like Ohio and Indiana and Michigan. So Thomas Jefferson had this notion of probably the first American president to think that there would be a certain zone of American lands that would remain largely unchanged, while there would be a large zone that would be intensively cultivated. So the distinction for him lay along the Mississippi River. But this was a vision that did not appeal to people, for example, who lived in Missouri, who did not want to find out that they were expected to move east of the Mississippi River.
Right.
And so his idea, while it's kind of pure in conception, is something that was not realistic in applying to the very complicated sets of people who lived in the Mississippi Valley.
It sounds like, from listening to you, that in fact, in many ways, this may have exacerbated some of our rural versus urban tensions from the very beginning. Sort of knowing where rural begins and where populated areas end. We have such a distinction. It sounds like.
Well, there weren't many cities in early America. The largest city was Philadelphia, and it had just 40,000 people. So that's the number of people that wouldn't fill up a Major League Baseball stadium today. So it's really a distinction between intensively cultivated areas that are rural and then areas that have not yet been intensively occupied by the citizens of the United States and still remained in the possession of native peoples.
Right. Mark, feel free to jump in here. I know that you also have thoughts that may differ a little bit from Alina's in terms of preservation versus conservation.
Well, I think actually, I think Alina really explained it pretty well, and we relate it back to, um, President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Um, Oftentimes President Roosevelt is thought, he certainly is a hero, and he's described as a conservationist, but it seems to me, um, from where I sit, that oftentimes the conservation idea is, as we see it today, is kind of merged sometimes by people who are trying to make a point to more of a preservationist as opposed to a conservationist. And the distinction between preservation, sort of a John Muir, so related back to art sort of perspective, versus Teddy's perspective, I think that distinction matters. Preservation wants to limit use. It wants to take, in this case, when we talk about American expansion, take the West basically and put it as if it's a preserve and it's a museum and we shouldn't touch the land. We should just observe it. And that's not obviously what Teddy Roosevelt thought when he ended up in North Dakota, certainly early in his life. And conservation is more about ensuring future use, which I think is what Alina was getting at. We use our resources wisely, just like the ranchers that Roosevelt lived with when he went to North Dakota, and just like our farmers and ranchers do today. We don't choose between nature and people. We make sure that nature can thrive and humans can thrive, and that should aligns at Pacific Legal Foundation. We think that aligns with liberty. Our first foundational principles that we developed there in Philadelphia, as Professor mentioned.
I think today we think about preservation, especially in terms of in regulatory terms. Um, Alan, when did that change happen? I think it sounds like from what you're saying, initially we were thinking about sort of cultivating the land, but we weren't talking about regulating it. When does that come about in sort of the American lexicon?
Well, it starts to develop later in the 19th century. So the first national parks, which are preservationist in principle, are established in the second half of the 19th century. They're very few, however, and it's really in the early 20th century that you see a more robust regulatory framework established in association with a larger federal government. So certainly Theodore Roosevelt is one of the key figures in that expansion of the federal government's role in managing especially Western lands, because the great majority of lands that are set aside for either preservation or are managed intensively by the federal government for conservation purposes, they lie in the West.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Mark and Alina, I'd love to bring you back in here in thinking about this, about stewardship and responsibility of the land and regulations of it. How can we think differently about environmental policy? How do you think our thinking has evolved since, as Alan's pointing out, when government really began to grow in the early to mid 20th century? How has that changed our relationship with the land?
Alina, why don't you take that and I'll follow up?
Awesome. Yeah, I think as Mark had also mentioned, we've really slipped into kind of a preservationist only mindset. And while I understand that, we need a lot of different perspectives in the environmental movement, I think it's genuinely good that we often have preservationist voices in a lot of these issues. It's become the only way that we see the environment, largely because it, pairs very nicely with a large regulatory stick. And unfortunately, kind of the policy tools that we've also gotten very accustomed to using, a lot of times not to much benefit, have been regulatory ones. And I think that a lot of this comes from the notion that if if you see the state of nature as being without man, and if you see the project of environmentalism to be preserving nature from man rather than conserving it for our use, then you will never be satisfied with the amount of regulation because anything will always be, seeping CO2 from people's mouths, and you will never be satisfied with the amount of nature preserved because it just can't be enough. And I really don't think that people often give markets quite enough credit. I think it's not necessarily a popular fan favorite of the preservationist crowd, but the shale boom, the natural gas revolution is a fantastic example of markets at work for the environment. And I don't think a lot of people often realize that markets can be beneficial for the environment. They often think that you have to regulate your way into preserving anything. But the vast majority of our emission reductions in the past 2 decades have been just switching from coal to natural gas, which was not something that everyone did out of just the goodness of their hearts. And it wasn't something that everyone did because regulations forced them to. Truly, that private innovation has helped reduce US emissions more than any federal policy, just because of profit incentives. And I think that kind of pushing more towards understanding that the power of markets and the power of true stewardship would be wonderful.
Mark?
I would, in terms of following up on what Alina said, which was very well said, I would want to connect it back to what Professor Taylor was saying about, we start with that idea of preserving national parks at the end or during the 19th century, but how Americans, and I'm open to be corrected by Professor Taylor for sure, but I think how Americans saw these few national parks and what we could do in those national parks was very different than the preservationist idea we have now. What we litigate sometimes at Pacific Legal Foundation even is, there's a couple of different things you can litigate. Number one is, okay, it's a national park, but it's our national park. It's public land. And, at Pacific Legal Foundation, we're often talking about property rights, which is about ownership and that individuals have responsibility to care for the land. But that's also true for our national lands. That is our land. And or do we just want to preserve it and set it aside, or do we get to use the land perhaps for recreation? That is sometimes what we will do. And we'll say, we've seen, and Professor Taylor mentions the national parks starting in the 19th century, but I would then fast forward to the 70s, where we went from, yes, we have these national parks, but these are public lands that we can use to, no, we can't touch them. They need to remain pristine such that you can't use them for even for recreation, let alone when we talk about, I think, America's energy needs, let alone for the natural resources that are contained within those lands. So I think that it was the what was obviously a well understood idea of preserving some special lands. The Grand Canyon, for example, has sort of metastasized, if you will, to where we are setting aside much of our natural land from being used at all, and then questioning, why are the costs of living? And I know I don't want to get ahead of us on the agenda, but why have our costs of living gotten so high? Well, it's in part because we've said we can't use the natural resources that we as Americans have on, our abundant lands out west, let alone Alaska and what have you, and in the Gulf as well.
I appreciate that this is a perfect pivot because I did want to transition to a discussion about land use and our expansion, and of course our reliance on different forms of energy. Land use is about resources, and I'm wondering, and I'm happy to hear from whoever wants to jump in first, sort of what are the risks to us thinking about the land in those terms? We have such a vast country. My family's from California. When I fly across the country, I'm always just sort of amazed by just how many thousands of miles of barren land there is between Washington, D.C. and California. And I'm just curious, what are the risks that this group sees to us making better use of those protected lands? Or opportunities. we can we can take it either way.
I'll jump in to start and say that I think risk is a good place to start. I think, again, I'll tie it to the late 60s and the 1970s, when the environmental movement as we know it today kind of took off. And there was an important case in 1978 called TVA versus Hill, under the Endangered Species Act. And it gets at this idea of risk. And what the Supreme Court said in TVA versus Hill, which was a case that ended up for a few years stopping the completion of the Tellico Dam in Tennessee, which was going to be a very important dam for energy production in Tennessee. But it stopped it in the name of an endangered species. And I don't want to go down a rabbit trail too far with this, but this was an endangered species that we now know 50 years later wasn't in fact endangered at all. It was just a little fish that was found all over the South. But be that as it may, what the court said in that case was that the risks to species, because of the Endangered Species Act, has to be by far the most important risk we weigh. And we don't weigh the costs and the risk to humans and the cost of living against that risk. And so that case, TVA versus Hill, created a principle, because it really isn't in the Endangered Species Act. But by giving voice to that in a Supreme Court precedent, and obviously I'm a litigator, so that's where I tend to hang my hat. But the environmentalist movement kind of ran with that idea, and we expanded it and exploited it, understandably so, to say that the risks of doing any sort of harm to the environment, whether it's a species or whether it's our natural public lands, far outweighs whatever benefits we can get as humans. And that's where we are today. And I would say that's where I would start when it comes to risk, that I think that the risks are not really weighed properly.
And Alan, I think if I were to ask you sort of the same question, you would say that at the founding, the perspective or the understanding of risk was very different. How do you think our, Jefferson and others in the founding generation would have weighed sort of how we use the resources and what risk there is to not using them?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind how different the country is today from its founding generation. The population of the United States today is literally 100 times the population of American citizens and their families circa 1800. The United States had not yet industrialized. The United States had a steady immigration, but most of its population growth was through natural increase, and it was growing pretty rapidly. But the primary problem, as the founding generation saw it, was how could we settle as much land as fast as possible? Now, when you have a population that's 100 times larger, it's not possible for every family to own a farm. We live in a much more complex society where most people are employees and in which the amount of aggregate property in the country is vastly greater and far more complex. And there is much greater inequality among the American people than there was in the past. So the risk as perceived by the first generation under the new United States was that the United States would not grow fast enough to be able to fend off potential problems from other empires in the world. The United States was not a superpower in its founding generation. It was a relatively weak country, and there were more powerful empires that were its neighbors, particularly the British Empire. So it's the calculations of risk in the founding generation are very different from those today.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful perspective. And I think when we're thinking today, and we're thinking about land use, we're definitely also thinking about energy. Mark, maybe I'll turn back to you for a minute. Obviously, whether we're talking about coal, as Alina mentioned, oil or gas, now renewables, I think our approach to energy has changed, our conception of the American landscape, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yes, yeah. I think the energy development is, going to be fundamentally a story about is a story about expanding human freedom. So from a historical perspective, if each of our transitions, from timber to coal to oil, and now as we are transitioning over time to renewables, uh, each of these transitions has expanded the opportunity for all Americans, let alone everyone in the world, and improve the quality of life. Professor Taylor noted that the differences in standard of living are more extreme than they would have been at the founding, from the wealthiest to the least wealthiest. But and I'm sure he would agree that the standard of living itself is just, we can't even describe how much better the standard of living is for everyone, even those who would be at that lower end of the standard versus the higher, compared to not just 200 years ago or 250 years ago, but even 50 years ago, that the standard of living, is just dramatically better, even if there is the difference between highest and lowest that might be more extreme than it would have been at the founding. And that's because of the way, the greatest natural resource, which I think is the human brain, has been able to put itself to work, and humans have put their noggins together and figured out solutions to our problems, energy development being just one of them. Every major expansion of energy has been an expansion of human possibility, has lifted us all up. And the challenge today, I think, is to get back to that American mindset, that we need to be able to innovate. We can't have heavy-handed regulation from the government, which may be well-meaning. And as Professor Taylor mentioned, certainly the way we went west was at some level managed by the government, encouraging plots of land and property ownership maybe at smaller levels. But that was a very light touch government regulation, if you will, compared to what we see today. And so if we want to see the sort of uh, great leaps in the standard of living that these energy changes from timber, coal, oil, now hopefully to renewables in our lifetimes, I think, if not our lifetimes, and certainly our children's lifetimes, those leaps come when I think there's less regulation getting in the way of American ingenuity.
That's great. And Alina, I'm sure you have some thoughts on how we're balancing energy and our sort of understanding of the land.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of is an idea that's been present throughout a lot of our history. I mean, over a century ago, we had Hatch Hetchy Dam, right? Like you we're kind of having one of these early conversations about, do we prioritize preservation of the landscape or do we prioritize infrastructure for human needs? And obviously, this was far before we would have had any conversations about many of the modern energy infrastructure that we're discussing today. But the same tensions, and I say tensions, not contradictions, as Mark mentioned earlier, again, because I think that a lot of times these aren't necessarily a left or right issue. It's not necessarily a partisan issue. Many of them are evident in the exact same policy instrument. I mean, you had the Biden admin saying we need to build clean energy and transmission. And then many of their exact projects that they were trying to elevate were delayed or blocked over land use concerns. And so you're kind of hearing the history repeat itself. Likewise, we have, as I think Mark alluded to earlier, is sort of the Trump admin talking about energy dominance and expanding some of this access for energy issues into federal lands, in conversation with the Biden admin restricting drilling in places like Alaska. And so I think oftentimes through, all well-meaning purposes, we have competing visions of what public land is for. And I think this is not to get too ahead of the energy issue, but I think increasingly becoming an issue as far as housing and land use, because this is pretty universally across the political spectrum. You have leaders talking about this housing shortage. And I think most of us understand that that's a supply issue, maybe not everyone, but local opposition is often centering on preserving open space or community character or natural beauty. And so we're really in this constant, never-ending prudential judgment over these trade-offs. And I don't necessarily think that there is universally one answer. I do think that we've pretty universally been heading in kind of an anti-progress direction as far as our regulatory framework for quite a while now. But I don't think that these issues will probably ever go away. But it's next verse, same as the first.
And listening to you, Alina, it makes me think that the word of the sort of the year has been abundance. We hear it from the left, we hear it from the right, and there's a need clearly to balance abundance with environmental stewardship. I think everyone on this webinar today are people who enjoy, appreciate, make use of the natural world and have an interest in it. And so I'm hearing you and I'm thinking, how do we square our desire for abundance? I think it's very different than at the start of the country. I think they couldn't imagine abundance, right? There is always a fear of shortage. How do we balance the need for abundance and growth with environmental stewardship today?
I think one of the benefits is that when you have things like markets for issues like energy, we're pretty incentive aligned. I mean, we talk about energy production, and obviously that brings costs down, and energy producers want to be boosting that. But especially when we get into issues like efficiency, a lot of people don't buy high efficiency washers and dryers because they want to help the environment. Maybe they do, but a lot of people buy more efficient cars and appliances because they want to pay less. And I think that we have a lot of market forces like that help drive innovation. And if we can, I'm not saying it's a panacea or that it always goes one direction, but I think oftentimes getting the regulations out of the way of some of this innovation can be really useful. Now, I don't think that markets solve every single one of our problems, given that we have so much red tape existing that kind of disrupts them as it is. And that's just the reality that we have to live in. But I mean, as I mentioned with natural gas, or we see kind of renewables becoming more cost competitive. I mean, wind and solar costs are dropping just off a cliff. It's absolutely incredible because of the scale and the competition and the innovation. It's not that anyone is mandating them to get more efficient, as if you even could. And I think that sort of affordability issue and abundance really do go hand in hand, where we often see ourselves as diametrically opposed to our motives as being opposed to those of the planet. But oftentimes the most efficient forms of energy are the cheapest. And we really do have a bit of a rising tide that can raise boats here.
I like that optimism. And I'm thinking, Professor Taylor, that if the founders heard us talking about abundance today, they might just sort of be confused by our our obsession with it. I'm curious what you think they would have said to this conversation.
Well, the founders were in favor of abundance. They lived in a thoroughly agricultural country, and it was the best fed country in the world of that time. And the cost of food was at the lowest of any other country in the world. And that enabled a young age of marriage and a much more rapid population growth, which was also keyed into the concept of the next generation will have as much land, even though it would be twice as large as the preceding generation. And the only way that that could be met was by taking more land away from native peoples, with the notion that native peoples were not using that land appropriately in the eyes of Americans, and that Americans would use it in a much more thorough manner.
I'd love for you to expand a little bit on the Native American perspective of the land and how maybe that still resonates with people in America today.
Well, native peoples, we can romanticize it in a way, and we end up distorting it. But native peoples had a much more, I would say, sober assessment of humanity's relationship with the environment. And they did not think of human beings as distinct from nature. They also didn't think of the supernatural world as distinct from the natural world. So they saw human beings as part of a spectrum of living beings that all influenced one another. So that when human beings approached the land, they definitely were extracting resources from it by hunting or by farming or by gathering. They did all of these activities and they understood that they were taking from nature, but they also felt that there was a certain restriction on what they would take, lest they imbalance the supernatural's relationship with the natural world. So, for example, if bison herds start to decline rapidly, there is the notion that somehow humanity has behaved in a way which has led to the supernatural keepers of the bison to take them away from humanity until they restored their relationship with it.
That balance is so important that they recognize, but it's fascinating what the motivating factors were. Mark, anything else you'd like to add there before I turn to some questions that we have?
No, I think that was very well stated by the professor.
Well, we do have a number of questions that have come in, and I will try to synthesize them a little bit. But one, as you can imagine, is the world that we are living in today. An area that is quite a departure from the founding is our use of technology and AI and the future of quantum computing as well. And there's a question about whether or not there's a market-driven solution to reduce the energy impact this will have on the environment, and how we're going to balance that with innovation.
Well, I'll start by just saying 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to hear Jim Danley, who is a deputy secretary in Department of Energy, working for Chris Wright, and he tried to address these kinds of topics. And for the most part, they went way over my head in terms of quantum and what those some of these questions are getting at. So I'm going to defer a little bit. Alina, do you have thoughts on this with because the questioner I thought mentioned NASA and GSA, not to put you on the spot, but I thought that was an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know specifically on photonic and quantum computing. I was less of I guess, directly scientific person. But I definitely do think that a lot of the sort of energy incentives can and hopefully will with innovation be reducing AI's energy footprint. I mean, I think that a lot of the behind the meter developments that we've seen with small modular reactors and kind of the incentives that are being proposed there through the Trump administration and just kind of using some of those policy tools to say, like, let's get it behind the meter, let's take it off of the energy grids, I think can let us have our lunch and eat it too. I understand that this is probably going to be a difficult transition period, but I I think that there are solutions. I don't know as much on the quantum computing part specifically, but I think this is a very good example of sort of those market driven solutions. You have, Meta and Constellation having these collaborations to bring major nuclear reactors back online. And part of it is for ESG reasons, which, also plays into the market. They want to look good and say that we're zero emission for their users. Meta loves funding things like that. And so they don't necessarily care if, maybe the cost of energy, the levelized cost of energy for nuclear is a little bit higher than natural gas at the moment, because they like saying that they're zero emission. I think long term, ideally, we'll see SMRs kind of driving down that cost, and hopefully we'll see, direct market incentives, and the SMR companies absolutely have incentives to do that. I think for, energy stability and affordability and abundance issues, we do really have a lot of external incentives to be driving down that energy footprint, not just because it's, out of the goodness of someone's heart to make AI more environmentally friendly, but because there are real societal, structural, and strategic pressures incentivizing that for the people running the data centers, making the large language models and what have you, and producing energy.
I think that's well said. I'll just add to it real quickly that I will fall back on our first principles, that even if I don't know much about quantum computing and photonic computing, what I can say is that as long as the government establishes rules that are clear and rights that are secure for the companies that are going to be developing through quantum and photonic computing, or advanced AI and what have you, then those companies will be successful. The problem we get too often is that the governmental permitting regimes are very discretionary. And so the American, whether it's working in a business or working on his own, doesn't know what is he going to be or she going to be allowed to do in terms of whether it's putting in an AI center, putting in a data center in a town where the local community is going to rise up against it, or whether it's going to be the federal government's going to make rules that make it difficult to build those facilities that would, will advance us as Americans. Even though I know there's this fear of AI and Terminators rising up against us, I'm an optimist. I think as an American, you have to be an optimist, and I think we're going to make AI work for us. And so the government's responsibility is, for the most part, to get out of the way, but I'll concede that the government should establish clear rules that everyone can plan around. And when businesses and individuals have the ability to plan on, okay, these are the rules I have to play by, the market then gets in motion, as long as it's not a too heavy-handed regulation, and the market then leads us to success. As Lena was saying, I'm not going to deny there's some role for regulation, even if in my perfect world there might not be. But the reality is, as long as that regulation is clear and not so arbitrary and capricious in the way it's being applied, these companies will be successful, and we will see market-driven solutions that do reduce AI's energy footprint, the way Daniel, the questioner, put it.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate the optimism. We are optimists at our street who are sort of grounded in research. It's not blind optimism, but we think that there is, the research suggests that we should be optimistic. And I definitely encourage people to take a look at both our technology and innovation program as well as our energy and environment program. I think you'll find a lot of optimism around AI and how we're going to adapt to it. I do want to look back a little bit. Part of these America 250 conversations that we are hosting is to help us sort of reanimate the values that gave rise to the American experiment. You know, the questions of equality and federalism and civic virtue and limited government. These are the classically liberal principles that undergird our street and our work. And I'm wondering if we can sort of reflect on those principles a little bit and what how they can help inform our view of the natural world today as we start to look ahead to the next 250 years.
Well, I guess that an invitation for me to jump in.
Perfect.
I would say that the founders felt very keenly that there was a tension between two goals that they had for society. One is to maximize liberty, and the second is to sustain virtue. Now, virtue meant something different to them than how we use the word today. By virtue, they meant a willingness to set aside one's self-interest to pursue a common interest. And so they felt that virtue needed to moderate the pursuit of liberty. So, for example, John Adams was very concerned that Americans were so driven by liberty to maximize making money that they would discard the goals of virtue, of being able to restrain that in order to sustain the collective good. So the founders understood that they had not reached the perfect solution, but that this tension would persist throughout American history as long as we kept a republic.
And I think that word tension is what's so important, is that there isn't, um, this isn't about one side winning over the other, right? But about us figuring out how do we navigate our use of the land in a way that's going to preserve it and conserve it. Mark, I think you maybe were interested in answering one more of the questions. Am I right? Yeah,
Yes.
go right ahead. Do
Yeah.
you want to read it for the audience?
Yeah. Brian Fisher asked a really good question. He says, please appreciate, and if you don't agree, discuss that it wasn't the Supreme Court that created the balancing test between risk to species and human costs, but the ESA, the Environmental Species Act, did. In fact, Brian, I'll go one step further in saying you make a very good point. To the extent that I said they invented it, they didn't invent it, but I think what they did was you could take that concept back to Mill, the idea that government should prevent harm. That is true. At some level, the harm principle that we're talking about, so it's not new to TVA versus Hill, but what the court did there, what I was trying to say, and obviously didn't say very well, is they said the harm to endangered species is an absolute harm that it's the trump card, no pun intended, that beats everything else. And that is what I think was the invention. It wasn't that the harm principle was invented there, but it's really not in the ESA. If you read the ESA, it doesn't say endangered species protection just trumps everything else. In fact, you're supposed to weigh the economic impacts of a critical habitat designation. I don't want to get too into the weeds of the Endangered Species Act, but what they did was they say harm to endangered species is trump card, end of story. And in fact, the court has been rolling that back even about a little less than a decade ago in a case called Weyerhaeuser. They tried to roll that back. The Pacific Legal Foundation was involved in, but they've never actually squarely addressed that language and said it was off base and was not a good reading of the ESA. But I was trying to make it for that larger point that the environmental movement writ large will say that preservation should trump everything. And even if and I don't want to, I don't want to get over my skis. I know someone else asked about the Native American approach to nature, but they did believe and still do believe in using the land. It isn't, you may argue with how much, but it isn't that certainly Native Americans didn't believe in preserving the land in the sense that the environmental movement would today, even if they would attempt to co-opt some of those principles.
Mark, you mentioned one of the other questions. Let me read it. Alan, I think this is really geared towards you. Are any of the panelists familiar with the ancient principle, and I hope I don't butcher this word, of usufruct? Usufruct? Am I saying it right? I think probably wrong.
Mhm. Mhm.
Cited at the founding by both founders and the Enlightenment political and moral philosophers who influenced them. It is both an American founding principle and one that is central to ancient Judeo-Christian, Roman, and Greek thought, and it mirrors in many ways the description Professor Taylor gave of the Native American idea of quote use. Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more, Ellen.
Well, my understanding is that usufruct is very much a English common law concept that is then applied by the settler societies as they expand. And they recognized that Native American communities had what they saw as just a possession right, because in the eyes of the settler society, Native peoples are not as intensively using all of their land as the settler society was prepared to do. So the concept of usufruct is extremely important to understand the expanding legal and land system of the United States. But I would not say that it maps on nicely to the Native American concept of land use.
That's very helpful. Well, as we sort of come to the end of our hour, I wanted to have a few moments to have some sort of closing reflections. I started the conversation talking a little bit about the Hudson River School and their view of nature. We talked about the founders' view. We talked about Teddy Roosevelt. We talked about contemporary environmental movement. Looking ahead, as we are with the America's 250th birthday, what do each of you think our relationship to the land should look like at, let's say, America's 500th anniversary?
Well, you are an optimist.
The Republic is
It's
here to
range.
stay.
It's
I know, third
human
century
political
now.
arrangements. The one thing history teaches you is just how short-lived they can be.
Yeah.
I hope there will be a United States in 500 years, and I hope we will have an environment sufficiently diverse that it will be able to support the human population without degrading that environment. Those are kind of baseline expectations that I would think that we would all share.
Alina, you want me to go? You go.
Sure, happy to. I guess I hope that in the next 250 years, we get a little bit more creative with how we do public policy. I think that oftentimes we see zero-sum games where there aren't any. The Endangered Species Act being a great example. Many of the species that are halting, billions and billions of dollar pipelines and projects could be saved for way less than the cost of those pipelines and oftentimes than the cost of the uh, litigation. No offense to any attorneys present, that it takes to just be litigating it. And so I think that if we would sometimes look a little bit past the A versus B mentality, we could see that we could do a lot better both for man and for nature than by simply assuming that it has to be one way or the other. And maybe it'll take us 250 years to get there, but I hope we do.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I hope as Americans that our relationship to the land would reflect the same confidence and freedom that our founding fathers had when they declared our independence from the crown. That it's that confidence in ourselves, in our ability to relate to the land, that we are not separate from it, that has shaped the country's history and hopefully will shape it. And again, as an optimist, I believe it will shape it for the next 250 years. We shouldn't be withdrawing from the land. We should be preserving it for sure, but at the same time, preserving the land that matters while allowing people to live, build, and thrive, just as we have for the better part of the 250 years, and hopefully with some degree of adjustment from the last 50. I'll just throw that in there.
Yes, incredible optimism, Mark. I like it. My last question for all of you then is I think one of the reasons each of us has a respect for this topic and enjoys the work that we do in thinking about this is that we enjoy the outdoors. And so I would love a quick round robin on your favorite either national park or or outdoor place that you enjoy, because I think if we get more Americans to spend some time outside some of these, we will find more agreement, more points of agreement moving forward. Alina, I'm going to let you go first.
I grew up in Buffalo. I think Western New York is egregiously underrated place in the outdoors, and specifically there is a little waterfall with a gas light behind it that you can literally light, and so it's fire behind a waterfall called Gaslight Falls. And that is the coolest place in the outdoors to me.
Alan, I
I'll
know
go
you're
next.
out. Oh, go. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so for me, if my accent hasn't given me away, I'm originally from New Jersey, but I've been in Florida the better part of my life. But for 3 years, I had the blessing to work in South Dakota, and the Black Hills of South Dakota were just incredibly beautiful. There's an apocryphal story that the Black Hills basically reflect the Rocky Mountains sneezed one day, and the Black Hills are what the sneeze landed on, and so the Black Hills are not as tall and beautiful as maybe the Rockies necessarily. Well, yeah, I think they are as beautiful, maybe not as tall. I would just encourage anybody who goes to Mount Rushmore, explore the Black Hills of South Dakota. It's just incredibly beautiful, especially Custer State Park, which I would put up against almost any national park. Custer State Park, you'll see bison, you'll see pronghorn, elk, coyotes, which is how they pronounce coyotes in South Dakota. So I now say coyotes. It's just a beautiful, it allows you to see a part of the United States very different, from the East Coast and the West Coast and Florida, where I live now, very rugged and rural and beautiful.
Well, I can echo that Custer State Park is a truly extraordinary place. And I'll just mention two other extraordinary places. One that I know quite well, which is the Appalachian Trail, because I grew up in Maine, and my family would spend much of the summer very near the Appalachian Trail in the Rangeley Lakes region of Northwest Maine. And so that's a place that I continue to return to. The other place I would say is Joshua Tree National
Yes.
Park.
Yeah.
And because it is so different from the landscape that I grew up seeing on the East Coast, which is a very forested landscape, and to be able to see the sky, so much of the sky, and to see how life exists in such an arid environment in forms very different from what we see on the East Coast was something that was truly expanding for my thinking when I first saw it, and I loved going back there.
Oh, I love that you mentioned that. It brings me back to my childhood, Ellen, and also Maine, because I'm an avid New Englander. Love to go up there anytime. I'm going to say that my goal in the next decade, I think it's going to be possible, is they are expanding the rail trails across the country. So all of these old railroad lines that have been now turned into bike paths, and we have used some of these rail trails in discrete spots like in the Hudson Valley, and up in Maine, but I think they're going to try to be connecting 3,000 miles of them through, I believe, South Dakota. So that is my goal. My husband has been alerted. That is the plan. Thank you all so much for being part of our America 250 Conversation series. I do want to let people who are watching know that we have our April event will be in person. If you are in the Washington, D.C. area, we will be having a conversation with Anita McBride about her book on the First Ladies. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. She's a wonderful, dynamic speaker with really fantastic stories about the way that women help shape this wonderful country. And stay on by for a great event in May and in June, and then we will all be celebrating together in this summer. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at future events.
Thank you, Sabrina.